In a time before internet and TV and for much of this period even camera, certainly color photography, people in the East became fascinated with the West, and it became enormous in the American imagination. If you want to know what the West looked like, you might rely on the Rocky Mountain School of Painters, people like Bierstadt and Moran here. They would go out west, paint the scenery that they saw, many of it spectacular and beautiful, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, the Pueblos, whatever it was, and then Yellowstone, and then return to the east with these paintings, and just giant crowds would go out and pay money to look at these paintings, because how else are you going to know what the West looks like? This will begin to inspire tourism to the West. And this is really the beginning of large-scale American tourism. It's going to get much, much larger scale. But if you were wealthy, you might take a trip out west and check it out. In the 1880s, we begin to see resort hotels pop up around the major attractions. For example, that picture on the bottom there, the black and white one, that's one of the early hotels in the Grand Canyon. And so if you lived in New York and your family had some money, you might jump on a train. The railroads, of course, advertise this heavily, and ride out and see the Grand Canyon, see Yellowstone, and see the Native Americans. Here are some Native American tribes who are paid to kind of interact with tourists. All of this leads to the myth of the cowboy. And Easterners, who of course by now are working jobs where they punch a clock, begin to romanticize the free-spirited life of the cowboy, where you just get up every day and do whatever you want. A major moment here is Owen Wister's novel, 1902 novel, The Virginian. The cowboys came to symbolize a freedom from social constraints, a closeness with nature, and violence is the solution to your problems, which is, of course, has long been a great American fantasy, that you could just shoot everybody you don't like. Cowboys come to be imagined as naturally decent, brave, and compassionate. And Western themes begin to dominate pulp novels, children's literature, in theaters, plays, stuff like that. And even serious literature becomes concerned with the Wild West. It's all nonsense, really. I mean, cowboys were not particularly decent. It was nowhere near as violent as it was imagined to be. They weren't blessed with some sort of insightful insight into the way the world worked. In fact, The Virginian in Owen Wister's novel doesn't really say anything. And apparently the reason Wister wrote him this way was because cowboys cussed so much, he couldn't put the way they talked into the novel. It creates this mythology of this silent man who doesn't say anything because he doesn't have anything to say. In reality, the cowboys talked plenty, and apparently quite profanely. But this is the mythology of the West, which is going to dominate American popular culture really all the way up into the 1960s. The Wild West show. These were shows, like a circus kind of, that would travel through the East to try to give Easterners an idea of what the Wild West was like. The most popular, but not the only one by any stretch, was Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Buffalo Bill Cody had been a buffalo hunter, a Pony Express rider, and an Indian fighter. And he developed this show that he would travel around the West. It was extremely popular, and you would go there, and they would do roping tricks and trick shooting. Annie Oakley was one of his big attractions. This was a young girl who was a crack shot with a pistol. He eventually would hire Sitting Bull, the great Native American chief we'll talk about here a little bit later. And in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, they would recreate Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But of course, at the real Battle of Little Bighorn, all the whites are killed. But in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, Buffalo Bill rides in the last minute and saves Custer's men. And Sitting Bull, tragically, would spend the later years of his life touring around the country and having to come out and be the bad guy in the Wild West show and sit around and sign autographs and that sort of thing. The West was thought to be the last frontier. In the American imagination, the West was the last unsettled place. Remember, we've been moving west from 1607, and there had always been this place just beyond the horizon that you could always go to if things got bad. There was always this escape valve, this outlet. Mark Twain's classic Huck Finn in 1885 makes use of that idea, as I talked about earlier. And they're also, by the way, always playing cowboys and Indians and Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, talking about that sort of thing. And there was this real idea of the civilized world of the East versus nature in the West. And nature, of course, was glorified, it was exciting, it was dangerous, it was interesting, and it really captured people's minds. Frederick Remington is maybe the artist most associated with this. These are all different pieces of his artwork here. And he made a fantastic living and became very famous creating images of the West. Teddy Roosevelt, after his wife and his mother die on the same day, tragically, in unrelated episodes, will become very depressed and will travel out to the Dakotas and live there for a few years and publish a 4-volume history of the West called The Winning of the West. Of course, it's entirely from white people's point of view. In 1893, at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a professor named Frederick Jackson Turner will present a paper. And he will point out that the census had always declared a frontier, and this is where civilization stopped. If you see the 1860s here, it's very, very clear where the edge of civilization is, right? With the exception of Denver there's almost nothing between this line of lights and California. By the 1890s, that line is no longer clear. There is not a line you can draw on a map and call it the frontier. And the census, the U.S. Census Bureau, stops officially declaring a frontier. Frederick Jackson Turner will say, now the frontier is gone, and with its going has closed the first period in American history. And a lot of historians really have taken to this understanding. We had this place where our imaginations could live, even if we didn't live. And that frontier is going to close in the 1890s. Today you may think about other frontiers. Outer space will become a frontier. The bottom of the ocean has kind of recently become a frontier. Things like this. But the frontier used to be a very real place that you could get on a train and go to quite easily, really. Here's an interesting map showing the center of the country and how it has moved. Now you'll notice it moves very quickly until about 1880, and then it moves very slowly in this here area where it's in Indiana, and then as about 1940 it's going to take off again. What they mean is half the country lives above this dot, half below it, half lives to the east, and half lives to the west. And so you can see how we have been pulling westward, and then in the last 100 years or so southward as a nation. The killing off of this this great American myth that you could always go west, young man, as newspaper editor Horace Greeley had said, will create this sense of lost opportunities, the dying out of an old way of life that is now being replaced with a new, different way of life.